So one of the things I wanted to touch base on this week was to continue our exploration of your questionable claims project. Last week we talked about how to find good sources. Today we're going to talk about how to read them and think about starting to summarize them. Yes, my cat has an opinion about that. So when you take a look at a journal article that's a primary source, it will have a very specific anatomy to it. Journal articles typically consist of several different sections, and let's go through each of them in turn. The abstract is going to be a shortened summary of the paper, a little bit like a preview, and you can read through that in order to get a really good picture about what the paper is about. It's also a really great place for you to find what the author believes is the most important findings expressed in very simple, easy to understand English. So you can look the abstract if you get lost in terms of what the results are. The introduction of the paper is where the author presents the basic research question and purpose of the study, as well as background research and the hypotheses for the study. I will say most people get really bogged down when reading the introduction and try really, really hard to understand it in full. I would say don't spend as much time as you think you need on the introduction. It's just basically setting up the main event. You want to focus much more on the methods and results of the study than the introduction. The methods is a little bit like a recipe. It tells you how they did the study, what the different groups were, what they experienced, what sort of instructions they underwent, what sort of questionnaires they filled out, and who they were. So you can look at this as setting up what the different groups were in the study so that you can better understand the results. The results is where the heart of the study is. This is what they actually found, what they concluded, what sort of decisions they came to. Keep in mind that for your questionable claim study, you need to go ahead and see what the research has to say about your claim. And you're going to find that out in the results section of these papers. So you need to be able to understand what the results are telling you. It can get really easy to get bogged down in the results section, especially if you don't understand the statistical tests. But keep in mind a few key things. The first is that if you look at any sort of chart, you should be able to track which group is higher than the other on a specific outcome. You should also be able to read the results section just in English, leaving out all the numbers, and be able to get a fairly good summary of what the important findings are. You can also look to the abstract for a good brief summary of the results, as well as the start of the discussion. So the discussion is the section that follows the results, and at the start of the discussion, they'll talk about the most important findings of the study, then they'll talk about the strengths and weaknesses of the study as well as future research. So the discussion is a good place for the authors to reflect on how well the study went and what the next steps are. And then there's the references. The references are a place where it collects together all of the sources that they summarized in the introduction to build up their background research. So one way of thinking about the references is that if you're having a really hard time finding a second source, you can look to the references for additional potential sources for your paper because they're all about that same topic. So when it comes to how to read a journal article, it's good to take notes as you go. Make sure that the notes you take are not direct quotes, or if you do use direct quotes, put little quotation marks around it so that you can track your note taking and know which words are yours and which words are not. You should be able to answer a few basic questions. You should be able to answer what the researchers expected to find, so their hypotheses, who participated in the study, how they answered the research questions, so their methods, what sort of things they had participants do, and what the most important findings were. And I'll say that last one is the most important thing of all of these. The rest of these just serve to help contextualize that last part. So I want you to really focus on the results of the study when it comes to applying those results to whether your questionable claim was supported. Don't spend as much time as you think you need on the rest of the parts of the study. I want you to really help to provide the basic findings. And did those findings support your claim or not? And once again, there are clues in the abstract and the discussion to help you out. When it comes to summarizing articles properly, it's important to understand that you don't want to unintentionally plagiarize, especially when you're working on a paper that involves very complex ideas and can use very dense language. You can feel often a little overwhelmed and can often unintentionally borrow a great deal from what other people have written because you are a little insecure about your understanding of the source. So I want to encourage all of you to engage in good practices, and when you are summarizing another source, to put it aside and not look at it directly while you're writing it, to see if you can summarize the most important findings in your own words. Sometimes even talking aloud about this with another person can help break it down into simple, easy to understand concepts. I was reading a study the other day where they did X and Y and they found Z. Just go through that exercise and see if you can explain it to someone else using simple, easy to understand language that's in your own words rather than reading from the source. Scientific writing tends to avoid quotation. Scientists focus on ideas, not as much words. So whereas you might have a lot of quotes from a literary analysis paper, the journal articles you read will very rarely include quotes from other sources. And I want you to copy that particular format and not quote, but summarize in your own words. So I would like you to try to explain your understanding of the source and to use your own words instead of depending on the author's language. Keep in mind that good paraphrasing is not just replacing a word here and there in a sentence and calling it done, that it's basically rewriting the sentence using your own words but maintaining the original ideas. So keep in mind that the best possible way to do this is to not have the source directly in front of you while you're working on it. Here are a few other things to consider as you're working on your paper. Sometimes a journal article that you read could have multiple studies in it, study 1, study 2, study 3, sometimes even 5 studies. I don't want you to get too bogged down in feeling like you have to laundry list each individual study and explain it in full detail. I want you to focus on one of the studies in detail and just briefly touch on the rest. What else did they discover and explore in 1 or 2 sentences? So you can focus on one of the studies and just kind of briefly touch on the rest of them if there's more than one study presented in the paper. One of the things I'm asking you for is to talk about how the study is strong, and I wanted to go through a few ways that scientists consider the strength of a study. So for example, if they use multiple methods of studying their outcome, if they have a behavioral measure, if they have a survey measure, if they're measuring heart rate or fMRI, brain activation, if they have a variety of ways of studying something, that makes the study stronger because they're using multiple methods to support their evidence. That evidence is better. Likewise, if they're using multiple samples of people, so if they have group 1, group 2, group 3, that's great. If they have group 1 from population 1 and group 2 from population 2 and group 3 from population 3, that's even better. So if they have a variety in terms of where those groups come from or their demographic characteristics, and they're still able to replicate their results, once again, that makes the study's evidence stronger that the research is generalizable to a variety of groups of people. Another way a study is strong is if it has real-world applicability, meaning that you could see evidence of it easily in the real world. Sometimes studies are looking at micro behaviors or very specific narrow behaviors that are very challenging to be able to see in the real world. But if a study resembles the real world, then it has an increased environmental validity. So that's one way of thinking about a study's strength in terms of the degree of evidence it brings to bear. We have talked about this since the beginning of the semester, but a study is strong in terms of its ability to make a causal claim when it's a true experiment. And it's a true experiment when there's random assignment of all of the independent variables. So if they have random assignment, that's considered to be a stronger causal argument to make because you've eliminated alternative potential causes. Once again, not all studies can be randomly assigned. You can't randomly assign something like gender or personality, but people still wish to study it, and it's still a valid question to ask. It's just not something that can be randomly assigned, making it quasi-experimental. If the researchers haven't randomly assigned their variables, have they worked very hard to control for alternative causes, and have they worked you through their process? Another thing I'm wishing for you to explore is how a study is credible. Now, keep in mind when we're talking about credibility that this applies not only to scientific research, but also to news stories you might encounter as well. So first of all, your articles have already passed a high standard. They've been peer-reviewed, which means that they already have a high level of credibility. There's other things to consider as well. First of all, do the researchers address limitations of their study? Keep in mind that if they do, that's a sign of the study's credibility, that you don't want researchers pretending that their study is perfect. You want them to be very open about the limitations of the study. And the more open they are about the problems and challenges with their study, the more credible they are. A good researcher is cautious about not overstating the significance of their results. So a researcher who vastly overstates how generalizable their results might have to be looked at with a bit of a skeptical eye. You want to make sure that their explanation of the data fits the pattern of the data. If they're saying this is the underlying reason, then it should align with what the data is showing you. I'd say any researcher that practices transparency, rigor, and skepticism is going to be very high in credibility. I would also like to point out a caveat, which is that it is appropriate to be a little bit more skeptical of studies that are older, that they might be dated in their methodology, and that they might have some issues when it comes to replicability. So studies that were published in the 70s or 60s, or even in the 80s and 90s, I would look at a little bit more skeptically than I would a more recently published study in terms of whether the pattern of results has been replicated, unless I've done some good research to indicate that indeed it is a replicable experiment.